I discovered my identical twin had been living my life better than I was, so I decided to take his. The notification popped up on my phone at 3 in the morning, and I nearly dropped the device when I saw my own face staring back at me from someone else's social media profile. Not similar, not kind of like me, but exactly me down to the small scar above my left eyebrow from when I fell off my bike at age 7. The profile belonged to someone with a different name, living in a city 2 states over, but the face was unmistakably mine. My hands shook as I scrolled through his photos, each one more painful than the last. There he was at fancy restaurants I could never afford, wearing clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent, standing next to a gorgeous woman who looked at him the way no one had ever looked at me. His apartment was immaculate, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my cramped studio apartment with water stains on the ceiling, eating leftover pizza for the third night in a row. Sleep became impossible after that discovery. I spent the next few days obsessively studying his online presence, piecing together fragments of a life that should have been mine. He posted about weekend trips to wine country, about closing big deals at work, about the marathon he ran last month. I hadn't run further than the bus stop in years, and the closest I got to wine country was the cheap bottles from the grocery store clearance section. The more I learned about him, the more bitter I became. We had the same DNA, the same starting point, yet somehow he had managed to build something magnificent while I had barely managed to survive. My job was mind-numbing, my apartment was depressing, and my social life consisted mainly of arguing with strangers on the internet. He had everything I wanted, but never knew how to get. I found myself making excuses to drive through his city, parking outside his building just to catch a glimpse of him. The first time I actually saw him in person, walking out of his building in a perfectly tailored suit, I felt like I was looking at a ghost. He moved with confidence I had never possessed, his shoulders straight, his stride purposeful. Even from a distance, I could see the way people looked at him with respect, something I had never experienced. The obsession consumed me completely. I started researching everything about his life, learning his routines, his favorite places, his friends. I discovered he worked for a prestigious company downtown, the kind of place that required connections and credentials I had never managed to acquire. His social media revealed a network of successful, attractive people who seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. They tagged him in photos from parties I would never be invited to, trips I could never afford, experiences I would never have. One evening, while following him from a safe distance, I watched him enter an upscale bar where he was clearly a regular. The bartender greeted him warmly, and within minutes, he was surrounded by people who hung on his every word. I sat in my car across the street, watching through the window as he laughed and gestured, completely at ease in a world that had always intimidated me. The contrast between his natural charisma and my social awkwardness was devastating. The breaking point came when I saw him with his girlfriend at a small cafe near his apartment. She was even more beautiful in person, with long dark hair and eyes that sparkled when she laughed at his jokes. They held hands across the table, completely absorbed in each other, and I felt a physical pain in my chest watching them. This was supposed to be my life, my girlfriend, my happiness. Instead, I was a lonely observer, pressed against the cold window of a life I would never have. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If we were truly identical, if we shared the same face and the same genetic makeup, then why couldn't I simply step into his life? The plan started forming in my mind like a dangerous seed taking root. I would study him more carefully, learn his mannerisms, his speech patterns, his habits. I would become him so completely that even his closest friends wouldn't notice the difference. The preparation took months. I started working out obsessively, transforming my soft, neglected body into something that resembled his lean, athletic frame. I changed my diet, studied his fashion sense, even practiced his handwriting from photos of notes he had posted online. I learned about his interests, memorized the names of his friends, studied his work history and educational background. Every detail became crucial, every habit a potential flaw that could expose me. I quit my job and used my savings to buy clothes similar to his, to get the same haircut, to practice his confident walk and easy smile. I watched hours of video footage, studying the way he moved his hands when he talked, the way he tilted his head when he listened. I practiced his laugh until it sounded natural, rehearsed conversations I might have with his friends and coworkers. The transformation was gradual but complete. The most challenging part was learning to mimic his confidence. I had spent my entire life shrinking from attention, avoiding confrontation, apologizing for taking up space. He commanded rooms, made decisions without second-guessing himself, spoke with authority about topics I had never even considered. I had to rewire my entire personality, forcing myself to stand straighter, speak louder, take up more space in the world. I rented an apartment in his building using a false identity, claiming to be a distant relative who had inherited money. The doorman barely glanced at my fake documents, and within a week I was living 3 floors below my target. I could monitor his comings and goings, learn his schedule down to the minute. I discovered he left for work at exactly 7:30 every morning, returned between 6 and 7 in the evening, and went to the gym every Tuesday and Thursday. The opportunity came sooner than expected. I was returning from the grocery store when I saw him in the parking garage, struggling with several bags while talking on his phone. He looked frustrated, distracted, completely absorbed in whatever crisis was unfolding on the other end of the line. I approached him casually, offering to help with his groceries, and he accepted without really looking at me. We rode the elevator together, and I marveled at how easy it was to stand next to him without him noticing our identical faces. He was so focused on his phone call that he barely acknowledged my presence. When we reached his floor, he mumbled a quick thank you and disappeared into his apartment. I stood in the hallway for a long time afterward, my heart pounding with the realization of how close I had come to my goal. I started inserting myself into his routine more frequently. I would time my grocery trips to coincide with his, appear at the gym when he was there, frequent the same coffee shop where he bought his morning espresso. Slowly, I began to exist in his peripheral vision, a familiar face that he would eventually accept as part of his world. I was patient, methodical, waiting for the perfect moment to make my move. The gym became my primary hunting ground. I would arrive early and position myself where I could watch him work out, studying his form, his routine, the way he interacted with other members. I learned that he preferred the treadmill in the far corner, that he always did 30 minutes of cardio followed by weight training, that he listened to podcasts about business and personal development while he exercised. One Thursday evening, I noticed he seemed particularly stressed. He was pushing himself harder than usual, his jaw clenched, his movements sharp and aggressive. When he finished his workout, instead of his usual quick shower and departure, he sat on the bench in the locker room with his head in his hands. I had never seen him look vulnerable before, and something about his posture reminded me of myself during my darkest moments. I seized the opportunity to approach him, commenting on the difficulty of the workout routine I had watched him complete. He looked up at me with surprise, and for a moment I thought he might recognize our identical faces. But he was too distracted by whatever was troubling him to notice the resemblance. We talked for nearly 20 minutes about exercise, stress, and the pressures of daily life. He was more human than I had expected, more relatable despite his obvious success. During our conversation, I learned that he was dealing with problems at work, relationship issues with his girlfriend, and the same kinds of daily pressures that plagued everyone. The revelation was both comforting and disturbing. I had built him up in my mind as someone who had everything figured out, whose life was perfect and effortless. Discovering his vulnerabilities made him seem more accessible, but it also made my plan feel more real and more dangerous. We started talking regularly at the gym, and I began to understand the person behind the perfect social media facade. He was intelligent and driven, but also lonely in ways that surprised me. Despite his apparent success and social connections, he often seemed isolated, carrying burdens that weren't visible in his carefully curated online presence. I found myself genuinely liking him, which complicated my original plan in ways I hadn't anticipated. The breakthrough came during a particularly honest conversation about family and childhood memories. He mentioned growing up as an only child, always wondering what it would be like to have a sibling, someone who understood him completely. The irony was devastating. sitting there listening to my identical twin express the same longing for connection that had driven me to find him in the first place. I wanted to tell him the truth, to reveal our connection, but I was too deep into my deception to turn back. Instead, I began to subtly steer our conversations toward topics that would help me understand his life better. I learned about his work relationships, his childhood friends, his family dynamics. He talked about his girlfriend's quirks, his boss's expectations, his aspirations for the future. Every detail became ammunition for my eventual takeover of his identity, but I also found myself genuinely caring about his problems and wanting to help him solve them. The relationship with his girlfriend was more complicated than it appeared online. She was demanding and high maintenance, constantly comparing him to other men, criticizing his career choices, and threatening to leave whenever she didn't get her way. He loved her, but he also seemed exhausted by the constant drama and emotional manipulation. I found myself feeling protective of him, angry at the way she treated someone who was essentially my brother. His work situation was equally complex. While he was successful and well compensated, he was also dealing with office politics, unrealistic deadlines, and a supervisor who took credit for his achievements. He worked long hours and brought stress home with him, often staying up late to complete projects that should have been team efforts. The glamorous life I had envied from afar was built on a foundation of exhaustion and constant pressure. As our friendship deepened, I began to question my original plan. The man I had hated and envied was actually someone I could relate to, someone who struggled with many of the same issues that plagued my own life. His success hadn't come easily or naturally. It was the result of years of hard work, sacrifice, and careful image management. I started to wonder if taking his life would actually solve my problems or simply transfer them to a different context. The turning point came when he invited me to a party at his apartment. It was a small gathering of his closest friends, and I was nervous about maintaining my facade in front of people who knew him well. But as the evening progressed, I realized that most of his friendships were relatively superficial. His friends were impressed by his success and lifestyle, but they didn't really know him as a person. They talked about work, money, and status symbols, but avoided deeper topics about feelings, fears, or personal struggles. I found myself becoming the person he needed me to be, listening to his concerns, offering genuine advice, providing the kind of emotional support that was clearly missing from his other relationships. For the first time in years, I felt useful, needed, important to someone else's well-being. The role reversal was unexpected and deeply satisfying. Instead of envying his life, I was actively improving it through my presence and friendship. The party also gave me insight into his girlfriend's true nature. She spent the evening flirting with other men, making cutting remarks about his appearance and personality, and generally treating him like an accessory rather than a partner. I watched him make excuses for her behavior, apologize for things that weren't his fault, and try desperately to please someone who clearly didn't respect him. The dynamic was toxic and destructive, yet he seemed unable to break free from it. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had left, she started an argument about something trivial and escalated it into a full-scale fight. She accused him of not caring about her feelings, of prioritizing his friends over their relationship, of being boring and predictable. I watched from the kitchen as she systematically destroyed his self-confidence with surgical precision, using intimate knowledge of his insecurities to inflict maximum damage. When she finally stormed out, slamming the door behind her, he collapsed onto his couch with a look of complete defeat. I had never seen someone so successful appear so broken, and I realized that his perfect life was largely an illusion. The apartment, the clothes, the social media presence were all carefully constructed props designed to hide the same kind of pain and loneliness that had driven me to seek him out in the first place. I stayed to help him clean up, and we ended up talking until dawn about relationships, expectations, and the pressure to maintain appearances. He confided things he had never told anyone, admitting that he often felt like a fraud, that he worried constantly about losing everything he had worked so hard to build. The vulnerability was heartbreaking and completely at odds with the confident persona he presented to the world. That morning, as I walked back to my own apartment, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of taking his life, I would help him improve it. I would use my knowledge of his struggles and my outside perspective to guide him toward better choices, healthier relationships, and genuine happiness. The plan was audacious and probably doomed to fail, but it felt more authentic than my original scheme. I started small, encouraging him to set boundaries with his girlfriend, to delegate more responsibilities at work, to pursue interests that brought him joy rather than just status. I introduced him to activities I had always wanted to try, but never had the courage to attempt alone. We started hiking together, exploring parts of the city neither of us had seen before, having conversations that went deeper than small talk about work and weather. The changes were gradual but noticeable. He began standing up to his girlfriend's unreasonable demands, which initially made their relationship more volatile, but ultimately forced her to treat him with more respect. He started leaving work at reasonable hours, setting boundaries with his demanding supervisor, and focusing on projects that actually interested him rather than just climbing the corporate ladder. Most importantly, he began to develop genuine friendships based on mutual interests and emotional connection rather than professional networking. Our relationship became the template for what real friendship could look like, and he started applying those same principles to other areas of his life. He became more selective about social commitments, choosing quality over quantity in his personal relationships. The transformation was remarkable to witness. As he became more authentic and self-aware, his natural confidence grew stronger and more genuine. He stopped trying so hard to impress people and started focusing on activities and relationships that actually fulfilled him. The change was visible not just in his behavior but in his entire demeanor. He carried himself differently, smiled more readily, and seemed more at peace with himself. His girlfriend, predictably, did not appreciate the changes. She had grown accustomed to controlling him through emotional manipulation and guilt, and his newfound self-respect threatened her position of power in the relationship. The fights became more frequent and more intense, but he no longer crumbled under her attacks. Instead, he listened calmly, responded thoughtfully, and refused to accept blame for problems that weren't his fault. The inevitable breakup happened on a Tuesday evening in March. She had planned it as her ultimate manipulation, expecting him to beg for forgiveness and promise to change back to his previous, more pliable self. Instead, he agreed that they wanted different things from the relationship and wished her well in finding someone who could make her happy. Her shock was evident, but so was his relief. He had finally freed himself from a relationship that had been draining his energy and self-worth for years. I felt a strange sense of pride watching him handle the breakup with such maturity and grace. The man who had once seemed to have everything I wanted had actually been trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty from within. By helping him break free from those constraints, I had inadvertently found a sense of purpose and meaning that had been missing from my own existence. The months following his breakup were a period of exploration and growth for both of us. We traveled together, tried new restaurants, attended concerts and art exhibitions, and generally explored all the opportunities his city had to offer. I was living vicariously through his experiences, but I was also contributing to them in ways that made them more meaningful and enjoyable than they would have been otherwise. He started dating again, but this time he was more selective and self-aware. Instead of being impressed by beauty and status, he looked for kindness, intelligence, and emotional compatibility. The women he met were different from his ex-girlfriend, more supportive and genuine, and his relationships became healthier and more balanced. I found myself feeling genuinely happy for his romantic success rather than envious of it. At work, his increased confidence and improved boundaries led to better performance and more respect from his colleagues. He stopped accepting impossible deadlines and unreasonable demands, which initially caused some conflict but ultimately resulted in a more manageable workload and better work-life balance. His supervisor, recognizing his value and fearing his potential departure, became more supportive and appreciative of his contributions. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. I had originally planned to steal his life because I thought it was perfect, but by helping him improve it, I had discovered that my own life had potential I had never recognized. The confidence I had gained through our friendship, the social skills I had developed, and the sense of purpose I had found could be applied to my own circumstances rather than just borrowed from his. I began to understand that the problems I had blamed on external circumstances were largely internal. My lack of confidence, my social anxiety, my tendency to avoid challenges rather than face them had created the limited life I was trying to escape. By watching him grow and change, I learned that transformation was possible, but it required sustained effort and genuine self-reflection rather than elaborate schemes and identity theft. The realization led to a period of intense self-examination. I began to see my obsession with his life as a symptom of deeper issues about self-worth, authenticity, and personal responsibility. Instead of envying what he had, I started focusing on what I could build for myself. The friendship had shown me that genuine connection was possible, that people could appreciate me for who I was rather than who I pretended to be. I started making changes in my own life, applying the lessons I had learned from observing his transformation. I enrolled in evening classes to develop new skills, started exercising regularly to improve my physical health, and began putting myself in social situations where I could practice the confidence and authenticity I had been developing. The progress was slow and sometimes frustrating, but it was also genuinely mine in a way that stealing his life never could have been. The most challenging part was maintaining our friendship while hiding the true nature of our relationship. Every conversation required careful navigation to avoid revealing details about my past or my original intentions. I had to constantly monitor my reactions and responses, making sure I seemed appropriately surprised by information I had learned through stalking his social media accounts. The deception was exhausting, but it seemed necessary to preserve the relationship that had become so central to both our lives. As months passed, I began to notice small signs that he might be developing suspicions about our connection. He would make comments about our similar tastes, our shared perspectives on various topics, our parallel reactions to experiences. Sometimes he would look at me with a puzzled expression, as if trying to remember where he had seen me before. I worried that he was beginning to notice the physical resemblance that had initially drawn me to him. The close call came during a casual conversation about childhood memories. He was telling a story about breaking his arm in a bicycle accident when he was 7, and I automatically touched the scar above my left eyebrow. He noticed the gesture and asked about my own childhood injuries, and I realized I had almost revealed our shared experience. I managed to deflect the question, but the moment left me shaken and aware of how precarious my position had become. I began to consider the possibility of telling him the truth about our relationship. The friendship had evolved beyond my original deceptive intentions, and I genuinely cared about his well-being. The lies were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and I worried that he deserved to know he had a twin brother who had been secretly part of his life for months. The revelation would likely end our friendship, but continuing the deception felt increasingly dishonest and unsustainable. The decision was made for me during a routine dinner at his apartment. He had been cooking, and I was helping with the preparation when he accidentally cut his finger with a knife. As I helped him clean and bandage the wound, he looked directly at me and said quietly that he had been having strange dreams about having a brother, someone who looked exactly like him and understood him completely. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication and possibility. I could have deflected the comment, changed the subject, or made a joke about the coincidence. Instead, I found myself nodding slowly and admitting that I had been having similar dreams. The admission was small, but it felt like stepping off a cliff. He studied my face carefully, and I could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no going back. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. He was angry, confused, and hurt, but also fascinated and strangely relieved. He had always felt like something was missing from his life, a sense of incompleteness that he had never been able to explain. Learning that he had a twin brother answered questions he hadn't even known he was asking, but it also raised new concerns about my motives and methods. I told him everything, from the initial discovery of his social media presence to my months of obsessive research and planning. I explained my original intention to steal his identity, my gradual realization that his life wasn't as perfect as it appeared, and my decision to help him improve it instead. The honesty was painful but also liberating, finally allowing me to be completely authentic with the person who had become most important to me. His reaction was more complex than I had expected. While he was disturbed by the stalking and deception, he was also grateful for the positive changes our friendship had brought to his life. He admitted that he had been struggling with depression and loneliness before we met, and that our connection had helped him find direction and purpose. The revelation that I was his twin brother explained the immediate sense of understanding and compatibility we had shared. We spent the rest of the evening comparing childhood memories, filling in gaps in each other's stories, and marveling at the similarities and differences in our experiences. Despite being raised in different families and environments, we had developed remarkably similar personalities, interests, and perspectives. The nature versus nurture debate took on personal significance as we explored how genetics and environment had shaped our parallel but separate lives. The most surprising discovery was that we had both been adopted through the same agency, which had deliberately placed us in different families to avoid the complications of twin separation. Our adoptive parents had been told that we were single births, and all records of our twin status had been sealed. The agency had since closed, taking with it any easy method of official reunion. Our meeting had been purely coincidental, the result of social media algorithms and my obsessive research. The revelation changed everything about our relationship, but it also created new challenges. He struggled with feelings of betrayal and violation, knowing that I had been secretly observing his life for months before we officially met. I battled guilt about my deceptive methods and wondered if our friendship could survive the foundation of lies upon which it had been built. The truth was liberating, but also potentially destructive. We decided to take a break from each other to process the revelation and determine how to move forward. The separation was painful but necessary, giving us both time to consider what kind of relationship we wanted to have as brothers rather than friends. I returned to my own life and my own problems, but with a new perspective on personal growth and authentic connection. The break lasted 3 months, during which I continued the self-improvement journey I had started during our friendship. I applied for better jobs, moved to a nicer apartment, and began dating with the confidence I had developed through our relationship. The changes were gradual but significant, and I began to build a life that was genuinely mine rather than borrowed or stolen from someone else. When we finally reconnected, it was awkward at first but ultimately healing. He had used the time apart to work through his feelings about our unusual beginning and had decided that our biological connection was worth preserving despite the deceptive circumstances. We established new boundaries and expectations for our relationship, agreeing to be honest about our thoughts and feelings even when the truth was uncomfortable. The process of rebuilding our relationship as brothers rather than friends required patience and commitment from both of us. We had to learn to trust each other again, to communicate openly about our needs and concerns, and to respect each other's independence while maintaining our connection. The work was difficult but rewarding, creating a foundation for a relationship that could withstand future challenges. Today, nearly 2 years after our first meeting, we have developed a strong and authentic relationship that enriches both our lives. We live in the same city now, but in separate apartments that reflect our individual personalities and preferences. We see each other regularly, but maintain our own social circles and romantic relationships. The balance between connection and independence feels healthy and sustainable. Looking back on the experience, I am both grateful and ashamed of my original intentions. The plan to steal his identity was born from desperation and envy, emotions that led me to make choices I now recognize as deeply problematic. However, the experience also taught me valuable lessons about authenticity, personal growth, and the importance of genuine human connection. The most important lesson was that the life I envied was not actually better than mine, just different. His success had come at significant personal cost, and many of his apparent advantages were actually sources of stress and dissatisfaction. By helping him address these issues, I learned that happiness and fulfillment come from internal factors rather than external circumstances. I also discovered that the qualities I admired in him, confidence, social skills, and emotional intelligence, were things I could develop in myself rather than steal from someone else. The friendship had shown me that personal transformation was possible, but it required genuine effort and self-reflection rather than elaborate schemes and identity theft. Our relationship as brothers has become one of the most important aspects of both our lives. We support each other through challenges, celebrate each other's successes, and provide the kind of understanding and acceptance that only comes from shared genetics and experiences. The connection I had been seeking all along was not his life, but the relationship with him that I had never known was possible. The experience has also changed how I view other people and relationships. I am more empathetic to others' struggles, more aware of the difference between public personas and private realities, and more committed to authenticity in my own interactions. The lessons learned from our unusual beginning continue to influence how I approach challenges and opportunities in my daily life. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had followed through on my original plan to steal his identity. The deception would have been discovered eventually, destroying both our lives and eliminating any possibility of genuine connection. The friendship and eventual brotherhood we developed was infinitely more valuable than any life I could have stolen or any success I could have appropriated.